Okay. Professor Ariel, thank you very much for your presence here. We were looking forward for hear your research. We know your contribution on Latin American normative question. And so the professor Ariel is a full professor of the Department of International Relations of the hybrid University of Jerusalem. Professor Ariel is PhD by Princeton University, and your research focuses on international relational theory, the normative dimension in international relations, peace research, international relations of Latin American, and globalization. I want to highlight three works that have had enormous influence on Brazilian and Latin American research. Maybe Ariel don't know about it, no? But it's very well known researcher among us. The first, peaceful territorial change, published in book by the University of South Carolina in 1994. The second, Son of Peace in the Third World, South American in West Africa in comparative perspectives, published in 1998 by State University of New York. And the third, the impact of North and international society, the Latin American experience, published in 2005 by the Notre Dame Press. I think currently Ariel has returned to early concern about territorial change, but from another perspective. I know. So about this new perspective on border is your new book, the unintended consequence of peace, peaceful border in illicit transnational flows. Ariel, thank you very much again for your presence here.
Okay, so I guess
30 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. A pity I don't see the students, but I guess they can hear me. Es un placer estar con vos en Sao Paulo en términos virtuales. I will try to talk for about half an hour and tell you about this new book, and then we open for discussion through chat, through sound, without seeing the students and the faculty. And thank you, Rafael, for the nice introduction. I teach at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, in Jerusalem, Israel, almost 30 years. Maybe you can hear my Spanish behind my English because I'm originally from one of your neighbors. I'm originally from Buenos Aires, Argentina. And as you said, I define myself as a peace scholar, and I have been writing about Latin America. And it's always glad to hear that the work that you write has a kind of impact. From peaceful territorial change, I remember that I learned about the incredible work of Baron Rio Branco, right? How he managed to expand peacefully the borders of your country. You know, in the north, people know about Bismarck. They don't know about Rio Branco. I think Rio Branco did it much better. In zones of peace, Brazil played a very important role in keeping peace and stability in South America, and also with the impact of norms. The book that I'm going to talk about, and you know, I look at this space as kind of space of publicity. I don't expect that you buy the book, not the hardcover. It has been published by Cambridge, and it's not only my book, which is also nice, and I want to share that with you because actually we are 4 authors there. I mean, I come first alphabetically, and it's true that I take all the responsibility, but I included 3 of my former PhD students that now they are doctors, and they are also a part of the book. They did research by themselves. It's not an edited volume, but as I'm going to tell you, although we deal with this book with the Americas, and there is some reference also to your country in the context of the TBA, the Triple Frontera with Argentina and Paraguay, we not only write about Latin America, but in this book, which I particularly like, and I'm sorry, you know, academics, we like to brag a little. It's for my number 5. In a sense, we cover several regions of the world, and I'm going to talk about that. And again, it's in a sense, it summarizes many of the things that I have done. But what I want to do, and I think I share with you, Rafael and Pedro, and with the students, right, some of the excerpts from the book, and also an article that we published with the Latin American Research Review that specifically refers to the Americas, right? Because we are talking about the Americas, and the Americas that includes North America, Central America, and South America. But this talk is about the book, which takes a larger empirical perspective by not only looking at the Americas, but at other regions of the world as well, as I'm going to present. Okay, so since I don't see the students, so that's why I always prefer Zoom, you know, with the little yellow squares that you can see the students, and that usually that's what I do. What I'm going to do, I'm going to walk you through the book. Okay, I'm going to show you some of the tables. I will try to summarize also some of the findings, tell a little bit about the logic, the theory, talk a little bit about empirics, and then again, we'll open that for discussion. So the trigger, and again, I want to return to the Triple Frontier. That's what I wrote in the preface, because the book came out of an idea, and it took about 10 years, you know, a book, writing a book, it's a long, long process. But in September 2012, almost 10 years ago, I had the privilege, and this looks like a noir movie, right? A thriller. I had the opportunity of interviewing the late Alberto Nisman. Some of you might know the name. Alberto Nisman was the Argentine special attorney that had to investigate the terrorist attacks that they were perpetrated against the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires in '92, and especially the Jewish community, AMIA, in 1994. And that terrorist attack was perpetrated by Hezbollah with Iranian help and some local help. And it seems that the terrorists, they somehow came, or they crossed the Triple Frontera. They crossed the Triple Frontera, which is the tri-border area of Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay that many of us know from the beautiful Iguazu Falls, Cataratas do Iguazu, that we share, Argentines and Brazilians, right? And in a sense, my observation when I was asked to write a chapter about the Triple Frontier is that maybe this has to do with the improvement of relations between the two countries, Argentina and Brazil, once they became democracies, and their relations improve, and you have Mercosur, that in a sense, the border became more a border of peace, and in that sense, maybe it became more loose and open. So that's the initial observation, because I don't want to convince you and my students not to believe in peace. I'm a peace scholar, as I mentioned, but the title of the book is The Unintended Consequences of Peace. And the basic argument that I want to make is that globalization and peaceful borders, in a sense, might enable the proliferation of transnational illicit flows. Some of the topics that some of you work, right? And because it's very topical in Latin America and the entire world, like the action of arms trafficking and drug trafficking and human trafficking. So we have a series of illicit transnational flows. And the argument we make is not that peace causes crime or that globalization causes crime, but that rather peace and globalization might enable illicit flows to prosper. Because we know the other argument. The usual argument is that when we have peace, then we have more trade, right? And borders that they are open, they allow for trade to prosper. So the argument we make here is not that when you have war, you have crime. It's that when you have peaceful borders, you have crime, okay? And the question we ask, the initial question we ask is you can say the positive social science question, under which conditions might peaceful borders enable the occurrence and proliferation of transnational illicit flows? Because of course there is a variance. And we want to focus especially in the period after the Cold War. Okay, so that's the initial argument. And as you were talking before, you were mentioning, Rafael, this is going back to my dissertation from more than 30 years ago. Borders matter, of course. Borders matter, right? But it is an empirical reality that we have to deal with that. And that empirical reality of violence and crime, it's, I think, probably the most pressing security issue in Latin America and also in other regions of the world. Because what we say in the last page of the book is that today people, they don't die because of international wars. They die because of civil wars. They die because of terrorism. They die a lot because of crime. And to some extent now we can add to that list this pandemic, but that's a different topic. So in a sense, what we try to do here, we brought together also different topics: peace, globalization, the relevance of borders, and two other topics that I will mention. One has to do with governance and the other has to do with crime. Okay, so I will share now, since I already talking 15 minutes or 10 minutes, right? And we academics, we have this problem that we can talk forever, right? That's what we are paid for. So I'll try, let me share and you can see, okay? Those are the page proofs of the book, okay? As you see, the unintended consequences of peace, okay? In the preface, we dedicate the book to our spouses, and in the preface, I had a little joke that I hope it's well understood, that, as you know, in Spanish, esposos and esposas is esposas, and esposas is also handcuffs, right? Which is you securitize marriage, right? And esposas, in a sense, remind the subject matter. But seriously, so in the theoretical framework, and I want to show you we have actually two conditions and three variables, okay? So let me share with you. So I'm walking, in half an hour, walking you through the book and through many years of research, okay? So basically, let me get there. When we talk about the analytical framework, okay? So basically what we suggest are three variables, and you can see them here. From these three variables, we try to design three hypotheses. Again, we are trying to explain the conditions under which peaceful borders might enable the occurrence and proliferation of transnational illicit flows. The first variable has to do with the degree of physical and institutional openness of the peaceful borders. So we are checking here to what extent the border is open, whether the border is closed, whether the border is soft, or whether the border is fortified. And this is a political decision of the bordering countries. That's number one. Number two has to do with the degree of governance and institutional strength. As we know from comparative politics, some countries are strong, some are weak, not in military terms, but to the extent that they can control their borders. And there is also a very important element, which is political willingness. A country might be strong, but it might not want to control the border, right? Let's look at US and Mexico. People only think about drugs and people coming from Mexico to the US, but there are lots of weapons coming from the US to Mexico, right? And it has to do with the lack of political willingness on the side of the US to control that, okay? So number two has to do with the degree of governance, institutional strength, and political willingness of the neighboring states. And number three, it's an economic logic. The third variable that might explain the variance has to do with the prevalent socioeconomic conditions of the neighboring states regarding the regional economic characteristics of the borderlands. So basically, we design three hypotheses that I'm going to mention that to you also very quickly. Okay, so the first hypothesis, let me find it. As I mentioned, has to do with the type of border, the more open, soft, integrated. For instance, many of the Latin American borders are integrated, so the European borders are integrated, then the greater the occurrence and proliferation of illicit transnational flows involving violent non-state actors. That's hypothesis number one. Hypothesis number two will tell us about the degree of governance. So basically, hypothesis number one will tell us, let me read that. Where is it? Hypothesis number two has to do, the less committed and able neighboring states are to control their peaceful borders, the greater the occurrence of illicit transnational flows. This has to do with capabilities and willingness, okay? And hypothesis number three has to do with socioeconomic conditions. And here there are two elements. Countries that they are poor, with poor socioeconomic conditions, they attract crime. And another element, it's the economic disparity. So we will find transnational crime from poor countries into richer countries. And that will also explain that, okay? That's regarding the theory. As for the cases, and again, I don't want to talk too much, but I just want to show you what we did. We did two things. We took, and I will show you a couple of findings from the Latin American cases, or the Americas, sorry, not just Latin America. We look at all the physical borders that we have in the Americas. So we include Dominicana, Haiti, but we didn't include the other islands. Okay, and then we look at several cases, and what we try to do, we look at cases from the Americas. So we have the North American borders, US, Canada, US, Mexico. Then we look at the Northern Triangle of Central America, Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. We look at the Colombian borders, and we look at the tri-border area of Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay. But again, we wanted to have a larger comparison. So we move contrary to Columbus. We say we move the other direction. So we have a chapter about Europe. So we look at Schengen, which is the borders involving most of the EU countries. And we look at the Southeast Europe, which is the Balkan countries, the Southeast European countries. Then from my region, we look at the only 2 cases of peaceful borders that we have, because I don't count the UAE and Bahrain, they are too far from Israel. But we look at Israel, Egypt since 1979 and Israel, Jordan since 1994. Then we move to 2 other regions of the world, Southern Africa after the apartheid since 1994. And we look at Southeast Asia and ASEAN, the continental countries, not the islands, since the end of the Cambodia-Vietnamese War of 1991. So we really had different chapters in different regions of the world. Okay, so what I'm going to do, let's say, Pedro, you are the master here. 10 more minutes, it would be okay? Okay.
Yes, perfect.
Okay, so what I want to do, I'm going to show you a couple of things from the American cases, and then some of the conclusions and some of the recommendations, okay? And then we can open for a discussion. So we have 2 chapters about Latin America. We have a general chapter that there is some background about, again, like in my previous work, about the lack of war in the Americas, right? The presence of peace, but there is an emphasis on criminality and absence of governance. What I want to show you from this general chapter, I want to show you a couple of tables that summarize the region. Okay, so there is a table, let me find that. I know it's a bit busy, but instead of a PowerPoint, I'm making a, paseando por el libro, right? Something like that. So what we know from the Americas, right? So we talk in general terms about transnational crime in the Americas, drug trafficking, arms trafficking, human trafficking. And then what we do, we juxtapose, the 2 elements. So here you can see that we have a table that refers to the type of borders and the degrees of peace we have in the Americas, okay? And what you find, with only a few exceptions, like US-Mexico, that has a fortified border and no freedom of movement, right? In most of the cases, you have freedom of movement across countries in the Americas, in Latin America. In most of the cases, you have integrated type of border regimes or interdependent, right? I think probably the only exception, Chile and Bolivia, they don't have diplomatic relations. That's one thing, that's one table. And then another interesting table, when you look at the type of transnational flows that we have in the Americas, so there are some interesting findings here. For instance, there is so much terrorism, right? There is no much terrorism going on in the Americas. Maybe there used to be, if you consider the FARC until 2016, right? Between Colombia and Venezuela, right? But in most of the cases, you have drug trafficking, as you can see, right? You have drug trafficking, you have human smuggling, and human trafficking. Human trafficking is even worse than human smuggling. That's a different category. And you have arms trafficking. Okay, so here we have all the border diets. Okay, that's what we have. And then we also look back and we look at several indicators like Human Development Index, GDP, fragile state, whether the state is strong or weak, corruption index, and Freedom House. Okay, and then we check the hypotheses. We check the 3 hypotheses in the American case, And we found more or less that the hypotheses are corroborated, right? I mean, for the Americas, US-Mexico is an exception because there the border is 1/45, but you still have illicit transnational flows. Hypothesis, the second hypothesis in the case of the Americas, it's also corroborated because there are many weak states and you have a strong correlation between weak states or states that they are relatively corrupt. I mean, you can have states that they're functioning and they're democratic, but still have a high level of corruption, like your country or like my native country, Argentina, right? So the second hypothesis is also corroborated. It's interesting that diets where you have strong states along the border, so you see less of transnational crime. Argentina, Chile, Argentina, Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, and Uruguay, Brazil, as compared to others. And the third hypothesis in the Americas, it's also pretty much corroborated when you see socioeconomic disparities, US, Mexico, Mexico, Belize, Mexico, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, Venezuela, Guyana, Suriname, Brazil, and many others. Okay, so there are only a very short list of countries with sustainable or socioeconomic conditions: US, Canada, Costa Rica, Panama, Argentina, Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, Uruguay, Brazil, and there you see less illicit transnational flows. Okay, so this is one first take at the Americas. A second, and again, I don't want to talk too much. We then deal into the different cases. We have a chapter where we deal in much more detail with the cases of the North American borders, the Central American, in the case of the Northern Triangle countries, for instance, there is a strong impact, the legacies of the Civil War, right? The legacies of the Civil War, it's a very important other explanation for the crime that we have within the countries and across the countries, right? Then we have a long section of Colombia. We found some interesting findings there that maybe there is some nostalgia today for the FARC. When you have the FARC, sometimes the FARC, they patrol the border between Colombia and Ecuador. Now, without the FARC, you have the bandas criminales, that they are much worse, right? So you could say sometimes guerrillas used to fill governance roles, right? That today you don't have that. So it's not that the conditions improve in Colombia, not to talk, and as you know from your country, that now a country that is in a catastrophic situation and became a criminal country, that's Venezuela. So it's a reversal of orders, right? So from Venezuela, you have a human flows, right? And you have other types of flows as well. Then, and again, I'm not going to talk about that since I don't have time. I just want to raise your appetite. At least perhaps your university can get a copy of the book if you want. But again, we try to find patterns, not just in the Americas, but in other continents. In Europe, I'm just giving you in a minute or two, some of the conclusions. In Europe, it's interesting because Europe, since it's more looks like a federal country, right? So some of the advantages that sometimes criminals have, what we call jurisdictional arbitrage, like economic arbitrage, that they take advantage of different laws in different countries, that does not exist within the EU. But once the EU is a single territory, then, for instance, that might encourage terrorism, that might encourage human trafficking, because once you get into one country, then you get into all of Schengen, okay? It's different, for instance, in the relations between Europe and Southeast Europe. There you have borders, okay? From the Middle East, for instance, I can tell you that there are not too many criminal flows because the borders are pretty much securitized. And Israel in 2013 closed the border and built a wall like with Egypt. But unlike Mexico, still you have a lot of flows because there is a lot of economic interaction. There is no economic interaction between Israel and Egypt, so there is no crime. Southern Africa and Southeast Asia are also very interesting cases. In both cases, you have countries that are magnets for the transnational criminality. South Africa, which is the economic hub for Southern Africa, and Thailand for Southeast Asia. Okay, so let me very quickly move to the last chapter. So I want to summarize and show you a couple of findings, and then I will be glad to answer some questions. Okay, so the book is not too long, so we are already in chapter 9. Okay, so I'm just giving you like the hors d'oeuvre, right? So okay, so let me show you the summary. Okay, chapter 9. So what we did, we checked the hypothesis, we compare the cases. Okay, let's see. Okay, so again, you can see here the comparing the cases, right? Like we did with the Americas, that we have drug trafficking exists everywhere. Terrorism, for instance, exists in Europe, right? It does not exist in other regions. Okay, and then we check the different hypotheses. So for instance, we found interestingly that the hypothesis about opening borders, it's not validated in the US-Canadian case. It's very peculiar. It's not validated in the US-Mexico case. So even if you have a fortified border, you have criminal flows. The hypothesis regarding strong and weak states, it's also validated in most of the cases, as you can see, not in the EU case where you have strong states, but still terrorism and human smuggling. Okay, but it happens in other regions, and the economic logic, it's also validated, again, with the exception of Schengen, in most of the cases. So just to conclude, and I can show you that, okay, regarding some policy recommendations. So what we suggest, we have to be aware of the normative dilemmas of human security regarding peaceful borders and illicit transnational flows. Like today, I guess you are engaged in similar normative dilemmas regarding, you know, the green passports and the requirements for vaccinating people or not. So there are many moral dilemmas here, as Beth Simons put, between enhancing border security and promoting human rights. Usually they don't come together. We call for cooperation. That's pretty much obvious. And the last point I want to make, and I have to emphasize that, otherwise I don't want to leave you with the impression that the way to avoid crime would be to close the borders or to have war, right? But what we suggest is to be aware of the unintended consequences of peace. We still choose peace, but we have to pay attention to that particular element that peace might be a permissive condition. Again, peace does not cause crime, but again, with borders of peace that we knew in Latin America for a long time, but now they also happen in Southeast Asia, in Southern Africa, in Europe, we have to be aware of that. Okay, so I rest my case, and I thank you for being a captive audience. And I'm at your disposition. Thank you very much. Molto obrigado.
Thank you very much, Professor. Very interesting book and presentation. If, Rafael, podemos abrir o debate?
Sim, sim. Agora com você.
Well, we have a first question here written from Professor Tássio Franchi from ESEMI, the Army School. I can read it to you. Arie, can you read the question in your Zoom?
I can read. I see. I mean, it's Tássio, sigo protocolo como preferir, but where is the question?
I can read to you. I think I'm the only one who has the access. He asks, it would be interesting if Professor Kacowicz would talk a little about the database he used to map indicators of human trafficking, arms trafficking, drugs, and other illegal activities to South America. Did he use a global database or did he look at different data from each country? Methodologically, how did he homogenize all data to treat South American borders as a whole? Professor Tássio Franchi from ESEMI, the Army School. So please, we can start with this question and I will gather other ones.
Yes, okay, that's a very good question and it's a kind of methodological question, right? And I would say two things. One is that we quote, I think, a very good article by Peter Andreas and a colleague of him that they warned about the difficulties of gathering data precisely about those illicit transnational flows, because it's not like gathering data about trade and finance, right? It's the, you could say, the dark side of globalization. So what we did, and it's easy because I'm looking at the notes that we have below that table regarding the different types of illicit transnational flows. For instance, so we try to use both a kind of global indicators. So we use a lot from what it's called, and I can even use the chat. So you, I think I can, let's see if I can, yes, I can use the chat for everybody, which is called UNODC, which is the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime. And they have an incredible amount of information. Now I can, yes, I can read the Tassio's question. So there are reports that the UNODC, they have on the different types of transnational flows, also on regional terms. In addition, sometimes we use some Latin American sources from Latin American authors like Ivan Briscoe, Cuevas, and the moment Dudley. So we try, we didn't, it's true that we didn't look at the sources from individual countries when we were in a sense compiling that. And that also explains, and that's Tássio, your question, why we didn't use regression. And in a sense, we end in the table in a binary way saying whether there is drug trafficking or there is no drug trafficking, okay? Based again on several secondary sources. You know, I was asking in a family gathering that I was telling them about the book, they say, but you didn't do interviews either. Right now, we have in the book only 2 interviews with the foreign minister of Guatemala who visited Jerusalem and a former senior immigration officer from Argentina in one of my trips to Argentina. But of course, we didn't interview criminal cartels, right? So I'm aware, we are aware that there is something missing in the sense that there is no field work there, right? So we are aware that we have to take that into consideration. I think having said that, I think that, again, we use sources both from Latin America or, for instance, the US State Department the CIA book. I mean, some of us, we might not like them, but I think there are also sources that are available. The European chapter was very easy in that sense because the Europeans, they have lots of information, right? So we try really to look at the authors who wrote about the different regions and global sources, right? But we didn't look, we thought about that, but as you could realize, even the data, it's really from 2010, 2015. We have been working on this for many, many years. So if we would go and look for all the individual countries, we will still working on this. Thank you, Tasio.
Thank you very much, Professor. Rafael, would you like to make a question, discussion? Meanwhile, people start to participate. Please, Rafael.
Ariel, why do you think that in Latin America there is not a collective action for attacking for the not rational consequence? These no intended consequence between the state, the Latin American state, because the transnational flows are tried like a national problem. But the nature of the problem is transnational. It's transnational problem. But when the state think about public policy, the public policies is think in national term, no in transnational term. Okay. Why do you think this problem about the no collective action to attack the problem among Latin American countries?
I think that in your question, you already gave the answer, Rafael. The way when you formulated that, I mean, I would say in general terms, it's interesting. And again, I'm speculating because we didn't really deal with that in the book. I mean, in the concluding chapter, we are saying, that you could say it's quite banal, right? That you have to encourage cooperation at all possible levels. But here, I think the comparison you could make is between, for instance, Latin America and Europe, right? I mean, Europe, which again, it's not the United States of Europe, but it's a much more elaborated form of coordination. So you will find that there they might have an advantage in having a regional policy. So I think that the general answer to your question, it's not only related to this specific issue area, which is transnational criminal flows, because you will find something, and I wrote about that, many people, we wrote about that, is that in Latin America, we are very good in labia, in discourse, Mercedes Sosa, right? Salgo a caminar, we are all a happy family, but in practical terms, it's not translated, right? Like our colleague in Spain, Carlos Malamud, or my colleague in Portugal, Andres Malamud, they write about that. And you see that, and you have to tell me, I think that even in fighting today COVID, right, you have a similar problem, right? Which is the prioritizing the national over the transnational, right? So and I'm saying that part of the answer, a second answer, you already gave that, is because when we look at the different topics in transnational flows, like drug trafficking or arms trafficking, or even human trafficking, or not human smuggling, but human trafficking, in many cases, it's first and foremost a domestic problem, right? It's not just a transnational problem. That's why in the order of priority, you first want to deal with your own national problems. Now, here in the book, we also made the distinction that we look at physical transnational flows, right? Meaning drug trafficking across borders or arms trafficking across borders, because it gets complicated. When you add globalization, you'll find that some of those drug cartels, they are not only involved in crossing the border, they're also involved in Europe, Africa, Asia, Russia. So it becomes really global. It's another dimension of that we don't deal with that, right? So I would say that the philosophical answer for your question, in Latin America, there is this peculiar problem that this reluctance in having a kind of supranational activities together, right? But again, just it will not give us a consuelo, right? But it's not that Southern Africa is doing better, or Southeast Asia with ASEAN, for instance. In ASEAN, they realize, and this is one of the findings, we have a chapter in ASEAN, you know, ASEAN, they are richer, they are, if you want, more developed. They invested in roads, they invested in lots of transnational interactions, but they are complaining nowadays that they are not investing in transnational cooperation in fighting crime, okay? So this is not a problem, this is not a problem just of Latin America, right? And again, I think that there is probably more and more of realization. I think this book is quite topical in that sense, that there is a need to enhance regional cooperation because the problem is not local, the problem is regional, if not global, right? But in that sense, the Latin American region is lagging behind. Again, in the Middle East, we only look, again, this was not a region, we only look at what we call a triangle of peace, Israel, Egypt, Israel, Jordan. So you don't have that at all, right? But in a region like Latin America, where the borders are in a sense soft, right? And they are penetrated and they are, so that should call for more of a cooperation. But I can tell you that, and there is some literature about that there is complaint that in the area of fighting crime, even the trans-regional cooperation, for instance, Europe and Latin America, they're doing better in other issues than in fighting crime. Okay, so that might answer part of the question, but that's a very good question.
Thank you very much, Professor. We have two more questions in the chat. I don't know if you can read it or I can read it for you.
Yes, that's Vicente, right? I mean, Vicente.
Yes, the first one is Vicente.
Okay.
Please, Professor.
Okay. Well, there are 3 questions, right, Vicente? So, well, the way to, again, you know, sometimes we academics, we are not the practitioners, right? So we again, and I always have a kind of normative bias. The way to decrease open borders with high socioeconomic inequalities, like in Brazil, Paraguay, would be to enhance the economic conditions of the poorer country, right? Again, it's not rocket science. It's what I think Obama, even Trump and Biden, when they try to help the Central American countries, right? They're not thinking in altruistic terms, because in a sense, what happened between the US and Mexico, they moved the border south, right? Between Mexico and the Northern Triangle countries. So in order to decrease crime, they want to improve the conditions in the Northern Triangle countries. That is a catastrophe. Okay, so if you improve the economic condition, then that would decrease a transnational, that would decrease transnational crime. Okay, that was your first question. Now, whether one side has to financially support the other, well, that might make sense, but I guess that, again, going back to what Rafael said, is all foreign policies, domestic politics. So governments, they don't want to be regarded as altruistic. You know, I was reading before this webinar, a seminar paper about Brazil getting immigrants from Venezuela. And the argument of my student was this has also to do with geopolitics. So Brazil uses that to come against or make a political propaganda, but it carries also some economic price, right? So the question is how you do that, convince your own population, right? That's the problem of getting refugees, although refugees and migrants might be an economic boom, right? So the question is how you do that. Now, whether repressive measures may enhance, in this case, that's also a very interesting question, right? Because I don't think that a militarized border or a closed border would necessarily resolve the problem. And here I think the US-Mexican case, it's a very interesting case because even when you have a fortified border, that does not stop criminal flows, right? So I don't think that the issue would be to militarize that. Okay, so that was for Maria, right?
Right, Professor.
Okay. Pedro, who's that? Mark?
The next one is Maria Paula.
Mark.
No, Maria Paula, Professor. She says, good morning, Professor. How the configuration changing of access?
Yes. Well, again, that's what, if Maria Paula, I guess she's from the trade in academics, she's or a very good student because she asks and she answers, you know. The answer is embedded, Maria, in your question, because in a sense, right, you could say, as an example, the demobilization of the FARC and the criminalization of the Colombian border is another, you could say, unintended consequence of the peace treaty between the FARC and Colombia, right? I mean, that's you could say the paradox and the beauty of the reality that you have so many unintended consequences, right? So in a sense, when the actors living on the borders, they change their dynamics, that might change peace, but that might also change how the border looks or the transnational flows. Okay, so I can give you, Maria, two examples. One example is the one that you gave, that we quote in the chapter when we talk about Colombia. I think Haskowski, Marcia Haskowski, she wrote about that, and there are other experts on that, that the border now looks worse because when you have the FARC patrol the border, right? One of the arguments we make in the book, which is not necessarily politically correct, but I think it's important, is that sometimes those non-state actors, that they might be malign non-state actors, sometimes they fill roles for governance when the state is absent. So once they are not around, the situation might be worse, right? Because you could say, again, I don't want to glorify the FARC, right? But it seems that in comparative terms, the bandas criminales are much worse than the FARC, at least in patrolling the border, right? So that might change. Another example of an unintended consequence, for instance, we found in the case of Israel-Egypt. You know, Israel-Egypt didn't have a very good relations. They have a very cold peace. And the fact that you have in Sinai, which is the border area, you have some non-state actors like jihadists, that led to an improvement in the relations between the two countries. They had to cooperate in order to deal with that common threat. And that, in a sense, improved their relations, right? So I think you're right. I mean, this is this is a dynamic process, what we wanted to call attention because we didn't see much literature there. And again, here I'm kind of criticizing my earlier work about peaceful borders and peaceful change, etc., is that, again, we have to be aware of these new elements and security threats, right? That they come along with peace, right? And again, I'm not saying, and that's many colleagues, they researched that criminals can prosper and proliferate in times of war, right? Dealing with other things. But once the borders are open, they can prosper, right? So we have to be aware of that.
Thank you, Professor. We have next a question from Marco Granja, the Major Marco Granja, then Ana Luisa, and then another question from Tasso. Okay, Professor?
Okay, I'm trying to read that. Okay.
Marco Granja is the next.
Well, the book does not say much about that. Okay, but Marco, I can write to you, or I can show you. I mean, as I mentioned, Maya Haskowski, Maya Haskowski, and I can write here. She wrote about that, and there is somebody else. I have to find the reference. Maybe I can find that quickly. She wrote also about that particular border. Okay, let me see very quickly. I'm looking at Colombia, Ecuador. The Colombia-Ecuador border, that's what you ask. So, Maya, she's the expert on that, right? And we quote her regarding how once FARC retreated, then the bandas I mean, that carried also consequences. And there is another scholar who wrote about the lack of governance in the Colombian borders. I have to find the reference. So we just have a couple of paragraphs about that. And you are right that Ecuador emerged as in the global drug trade as a cocaine producer. I think Idler, that's her name, Idler, I don't remember her first name. She wrote about that. She's an expert on that, So we do here name dropping as academics. We keep quoting each other, right? So Maya and Idler, what's her first name? I can tell you in a moment. Idler, she has a wonderful, yes, Annette Idler, okay? Annette Idler, she has a wonderful a couple of excellent articles about securing peace in the borderlands regarding Colombia and impunity and illicit governance across Colombia's borders in defense studies, an article from 2018, and that would answer your particular question, okay?
Thank you, Professor. Next one is Ana Luisa Pedovac. She asks about the role of state capacity.
Okay, great, Ana Luisa. I like your question. I'm again, that this is a new subject, but the previous book that I had from 8 years ago, also with Cambridge, was about globalization, poverty, and the distribution of wealth. And the argument that I have in this book, it's very similar. And this is exactly what you wrote, that I found that in many cases, the role of state capacity in allowing the illicit flows in Latin America or elsewhere it's crucial, okay? And what we have in the book, and again, it's not our original typology, but we found a very interesting typology that you see that the relations between states and criminal organizations within the country, outside of the country, they are in a range from alliance to confrontation, right? So you have cases today like Maduro in Venezuela, and we know that there is a symbiosis. It's a mafia state, or, I know we go on record, I don't care, Russia, we call today Russia, it's a mafia state. I hope I will be fine. Okay, so you see that states and criminals. But what is interesting is that you have some intermediate situations, like in Mexico, like in Colombia, right? So what you are asking, Ana Luisa, is crucial regarding the second hypothesis. We were criticized, I can tell you, but that's another lecture. To get a book in Cambridge, right? You have to write and rewrite. So we were criticized after the first draft that we were talking only about strong and weak states, ignoring the issue of political willingness. Because in many cases, and I would add to your question, Ana Luisa, it's not just the role of state capacity, it's also the political willingness. There might be the case that the state can control crime, but it does not want to control crime. And I can tell you, and this has to do not with Sao Paulo, but with Rio. We quote, there is a great book by some German colleagues that you might know, Thomas Risse and Tanya Burgel, on areas of limited statehood, okay? Because in the book, we also, and this refers to your question, Ana Luisa, areas of limited governance. Ann Clunan and Harold Trincunas edited a book on that. And I remember, I was a discussant, Catherine Sickin, and Catherine Sickin deals a lot with Latin America. She's a great scholar. So she engaged in a discussion with Thomas Risse and Tanya Burgel, whether the Brazilian police can control the Rio favelas, or it does not want to control the Rio favelas, because those are two different things. So it's not about state capacity, it's also about state willingness, right? Because that carries a price. So I think that in that sense, state capacity and willingness, it's crucial. This is hypothesis number 2. And that explains a lot, right? That explains a lot regarding Colombia, why maybe Brazil and Argentina can do better, but in order to do better, they have to be less corrupt. Why Canada is doing pretty well, right? Why the US might be doing well with Mexico, with Canada, but because of the lobby of the, what it's called National Rifle Association, allows for the weapons transfer from north to south. Okay, so it all, and it's funny because many of us, we are IR people, right? The older I get, the more I get convinced that it's all about the domestic politics and comparative politics and even local politics. So the role of the state is crucial here. Ana Luisa, you are completely right.
Thank you very much, Professor. We have one last question from Professor Tassio. I will open from him to ask here by the microphone.
Okay, and can be in English. When you talk English, it's like me with a Spanish accent. You talk with a Portuguese accent, can be in Spanish as you wish.
Thank you, Professor. Please, Tassio, por favor, pode fazer a pergunta.
Hello. Hello,
Hola.
Professor. Hello, Professor Kacowicz. You prefer the question in Spanish or English?
Como vos quieras. I may, as you wish.
Well, if the seminar is in English, let's do it in English.
That's
Well,
fine.
Professor, one question is, you talk about in your recent book. I'm very interested in reading this book now about this this flow. Yeah, this illicit flow in front of the borders. Well, we talk about in behind this subject is this very complex group of no violent or violent no state actors. Yep. And my question is in this direction, because this group is very complex. It's very how to say. The question is, I think it's very important to try build a taxonomy of these actors. Yeah. And my question is this: if you already think about this, think about how you could build a taxonomy of these actors, and thinking specifically from South America, because when you look at these groups, and in Europe, they have a model. In Africa, they have another model. Here, they have another model. The main question is, you're already thinking about this, how to classify this group. Why? Because if you think about how the state will work with this group, against this group, not just in the hard means, but in social means. Yeah, how to develop some regimes to get a good response, to people don't flow inside these groups. You must need to understand how this group operates. That's the question. If you think about something about this groups.
Well, I would say, Tasio, there is always a kind of a tension, or we can still see you, Tasio. You see, that's why I always prefer a Zoom to webinar, because it's much nicer to interact. I mean, we still are virtually, but it's nicer. So what I start saying is that there is, I think it's like the first question. I think you also asked about the methodology, right? I think that was you, right? The methodology, the sources for the material. So I think the tension here is the attempt to find patterns, right? And when we try to find patterns, and my particular style always has been to try to find patterns across regions, right? So in that sense, finding similarities. So we'll find again, we'll have transnational criminal organizations, rights organizations, guerrilla groups, terrorist groups. And I'm aware that guerrilla and terrorist is not the same thing. Here in Israel, in Hebrew, there is a tendency to call everybody a terrorist. You have to be careful with that, okay? And so you might find that in many different places, right? Because we have a chapter of Southeast Asia, and there they have another triangle, which is called the Golden Triangle, right? So, and again, you have there drug traffickers and human traffickers, and then there are peculiar cases. So I think it's chapter 4, which is where we have the cases. So we have some descriptions, for instance, the Maras. When you write a book, that also I had to study about. I was not aware that the Maras is really a transnational phenomena, because they grew in the LA ghettos, and then they were deported by the US back to the Central American countries, right? So you have the Maras, and then you have the FARC in Colombia, and you have the Bakrim in Colombia, etc. Right? So some of them might be peculiar, but and we have some discussion of them, okay? But that was not, it's interesting because we focus more on the flows, and we focus less on the, what we call generically, you can call them, and there is a literature, some of you wrote about that, violent non-state actors, VNS, right? Violent non-state actors. And although my first tendency, because that's a normative connotation, would be to call them malign, because those are malign violent non-state actors, right? Still, we qualify that in the book in a couple of places, as we were talking before, that even if they are malign, sometimes they might fulfill some positive governance functions. Okay, and we know that nowadays from COVID, those stories how the drug cartels in Colombia, they take the kids about food or testing, etc. Because if the state is not there, or in Mexico, right? So it's more complicated. I agree with you. Still, I would make the argument, and again, it's my own bias, that all the drug traffickers and human traffickers and weapons traffickers, they have economic interests, you know, and here I might sound very much Latino. I sometimes compare them to multinational corporations, right? They want to make money. They want to make money. Now, guerrilla groups, terrorist groups might be a bit different because they might have ideological political goals, right? That's a different category. Although, again, just to conclude the answer to your question, and again, there is nothing new, but we also discover in the different cases that nowadays you also have a very symbiotic relation between terrorists or guerrilla groups and criminal groups, because in many cases they engage in criminal activities to pay for their operations, right? And I think that's the sad story of what happened to FARC. They start in very ideological terms and they end alienating themselves from most of the population, right? Because they became criminals. Still, perhaps they were better criminals than the Bakrim nowadays, right? So, and I can tell you, Tassio, there is a literature, and again, you know, in this name dropping, and I can quote him. Let's see if I can use the chat. Yes, I have a colleague of mine who's a brilliant political scientist. He used the term, you would like it. He used the term, it's like a Sherwood forest. You know, those violent non-state actors, they work in a Sherwood forest. His name is Oren Barak. He's an expert interesting on Lebanese politics, right? But he also wrote about this idea of violent non-state actors. So I think there is a need for a more clear typology. We don't have that here in the book. I think we have other things in the book, but not that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. We have no more questions here in the chat. So, Rafael, would you like to close our excellent lecture? Thank you very much, Professor. Please, Rafael.
But are there other questions now?
No.
No. Okay. Okay. Ariel, thank you very much in name of the Department of Political Science for your fantastic lecture and in discussion. Time ago, we were looking forward for hearing your discussion about your research, in new vein, new research. For the department, it's very important your research, you current research, and because it had enormous influence in our research of our students. Thank you, Ariel. And we hope to see you more times, more time here at USP, in Brazil.
Okay, maybe. Thank you very much. Muito obrigado, all of you, and take care. And we hope for better times and perhaps we'll see each other in Nashville, Tennessee, or Buenos Aires, Argentina in 2022. Okay? And greetings to the students that I cannot see. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much.
Abraço,
Professor.
Okay,
abraço e obrigado,
abraço.
Arie.
Ciao.